weekly Torah portion. This week, the Parsha is Shoftim. It's about judges, but it's also a Parsha about all the different institutions of leadership in the Jewish people. It starts off with judges, it goes on to talk about prophets, it talks about kings, and the Kohanim, the priests. So we have actually 4 different pillars of justice and spiritual leadership. And they're channeled through the judges who transmit the Torah, the teachings of Torah. It goes through the king who's in charge of the country. The king is the heart of the country. He gives life to the country. It goes through the Nevi'im. The Nevi'im are the ones who communicate the divine inspiration. The Navi cannot change the laws. He cannot adjudicate laws as a prophet. He could be doing that as a judge, but not as a prophet. But he's the one who cements a relationship with God. And then the Kohen is the one who does the service in the temple, which brings us closer to God as well. In the Messianic age, Mashiach himself will incorporate several of these areas of leadership. Mashiach will be a king, first and foremost. He's called Melech HaMashiach. Mashiach will also be a Rav, a teacher. He will teach Torah to everyone, including Moshe Rabbeinu, it said. Mashiach will also be the greatest prophet that ever lived, second only to Moshe Rabbeinu, to Moses, as the Rambam says, and according to another Talmudic source, Midrashic source, he will even be greater than Moses in prophecy, but certainly in that league. The only thing is that Mashiach himself is not a Kohen. But we know that Moshe, who was not a Kohen officially, because his brother Aaron was chosen, nevertheless, according to one opinion of the Talmud, had the status as of a Kohen Gadol, of a high priest. One could suggest that perhaps Mashiach also will enjoy that status. So Mashiach will incorporate and consolidate all the different forms of leadership. But in the past, they were mostly separated because of what we call in America the separation of powers. You don't want the Kohen, who's involved in the spiritual leadership, to become a political leader. And that's where the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, the heroes of Hanukkah, the Maccabees, that's where their children or grandchildren went astray. They were Kohanim, they were priests, they dedicated the temple, they liberated the temple, they were great heroes. But then the children and the grandchildren began to assume political power to the point where they arrogated to themselves the position of the monarchy. They were both Kohen Gadol, high priest, and monarchs. And according to Nachmanides, that was their downfall. That's why they ultimately were destroyed, eliminated by Herod, the king, who massacred all of the descendants of the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, because they compromised the position of the priesthood. Anyhow, going back to the opening part of the Parsha, Shoftim v'shotrim titelucha b'chol sha'arecha. Judges and officers shall you appoint in all of your cities, which God gives you. Now it talks about judges and officers. Judges are there to determine what the law is, to judge people, and the shotrim, the officers, are there to implement the laws. The Rebbe pointed out that when you look in the prophecy of the future, the Messianic age, and we also say this in our prayers, we talk about Shoftim, Shoftayich, and V'yoatzayich, and your advisors, not your officers. And the Rebbe gives a very simple explanation that in the Messianic age, we won't need officers. What are the officers all about? They implement the laws that the judges have ruled to make sure that they are put into practice. If someone doesn't want to follow the law, just like we have police officers, they are the ones who enforce the law. In the Messianic age, we won't need to enforce the law because everyone will want to do it. So then why do you need advisors? So the Rebbe explains that there are 2 functions to leadership. There's one function which is similar to that of a judge who just dictates the law, tells you what the Torah says, what's right, what's wrong. He's aloof, he's distant, because he's coming from on high. He's coming from a higher source of authority and dictating it to the people, because that's the only way he can do it, because it's not his law, it's the Torah's law, it's God's law. But then in order to make people not just do it because they are commanded to do it, but they feel comfortable with it, they are receptive to it. That is the function of the yoatzayich, the advisors. They are the ones who make it palatable, who bring empathy to the people and serve the people not from a higher perch, but from their own level, with empathy and feeling and brotherhood. That is the ultimate type of leadership, where you dictate truth uncompromisingly, but then you go down to the level of the people who you are leading to show your concern for them, your empathy for them, that you are advising them as a good friend, not imposing, but advising. Then the Torah goes on to talk about how judges should not pervert justice. They should not take any bribes, because bribery blinds the eyes of the judges. Whenever a person has a vested interest in any area of life, and they're certain that they're right, they should re-examine their motives and say, could it be that my own self-interest is coloring my judgment and my perception? And that is the reason why the Rebbe strongly recommended and pleaded, actually, for everyone to have a mentor, someone who could be an objective outsider, but also has empathy, as I mentioned before, that could help you in determining what is the right course in your life. One should not be influenced by their own self-interest. The Torah then goes on to talk about how the judges are the ones who should determine what's right and what's wrong in all different areas. If a matter of judgment will be hidden from you, between blood and blood, between verdict and verdict, between affliction and affliction, all matters of disputes in your cities, you shall go to this place, you shall come to the Kohanim, the Levites, and to the judge, who will be in those days. And you shall inquire, and they will tell you the word of judgment. Those days means that throughout Jewish history, the Torah is saying that you have to go to the rabbis. That the rabbis is defined as those people who are experts on Jewish law, and they will tell you how to behave. And then it says you shall do according to the word that they will tell you. And then it goes on to say, according to the teaching that they will teach you, and according to the judgment that they will say to you, shall you do. You shall not turn from the word that they will tell you, right or left. So here we have a clear source for rabbinic legislation. We know that the Torah tells us that we're obligated to observe all the commandments. There are a total of 613, but yet the rabbis added additional commandments. They instituted the holiday of Hanukkah. They instituted the washing of hands before eating bread. They instituted many of the blessings, most of the blessings, and many other restrictions. On what basis? The Torah says not to add on to the 613. And Maimonides explains they didn't add on. They're not saying the Torah gives us more than 613. What they're saying is that the Torah empowered them, and not only empowered them, but commanded them to legislate whenever there's a need in order to protect the observance of the other 613 and to protect society when new needs arise, and we're supposed to follow them. And Maimonides explains, why is it when we light the Hanukkah candles, for example, we say a blessing in which we recite how God commanded us with his commandments and commanded us to light the Hanukkah lights. Well, where did God command us to light the Hanukkah lights? And the Talmud explains, and Maimonides cites this, it says in the Torah, do not stray, do not turn away from the words that they will tell you right and left. You shall do everything that they tell you. So, the Maimonides then explains the blessing as follows. Blessed are you, God, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments, and commanded us that we shall follow the words of the sages who commanded us to light the Hanukkah candles. The Alter Rebbe in his Tanya explains that the authority for rabbinic legislation is not in addition to the 613 commandments, but it is an offshoot of the 613. They are derivatives. They are incorporated within the 613. Then it goes on to talk about the monarchy. When you come to the land that God gives you, and you'll say, I will set a king over myself, like all the nations that are around me, then the Torah says, you shall surely set over yourself a king, whom God your God shall choose from among your brethren. Shall you set a king upon yourselves? So that it seems on one hand that it's only when people want a king, then you have to appoint one. But appointing a king is not a thing that God really wants. And in fact, later on, when the Jews come to the prophet Shmuel and they say, give us a king like all the other nations, he was very upset at them. So Maimonides and others asked the question, but the Torah commands us to appoint a king. And one of the answers is that they wanted a king for the wrong reason. They wanted to be like the nations around them. They didn't want a king as one who inspires them to get closer to God. That's why they were faulted. But the idea of having a king is not a negative, according to Maimonides and most others. It is a positive, and not only that, but in the Messianic age, Mashiach will be the ultimate king. He will be called Melech HaMashiach, the Messianic king. Moses, it says, was also a king. That's mentioned in the book of Deuteronomy. Joshua was also a king, according to Maimonides. So that the idea of having a king is not a negative, as long as the king recognizes that his role is not just to be like other monarchs, but his role is to connect the person to God. Now there's an interesting halacha, there's an interesting rule, that if a parent, whom you have to give honor, says, please don't give me the honor that you are obligated to give me, I'm foregoing my honor, a parent can do that. A teacher of Torah, whom you're obligated to honor, biblically obligated. If the teacher of Torah says, don't give me any honor, don't stand up for me when I walk in the room, he could forgo his honor. But a king who forgoes his honor and says, don't show me any honor more than any other person, treat me like an ordinary person. In his humility he may say that. You're not supposed to listen to him. He cannot forgo his honor. Why? So the simple explanation is that a Torah scholar, you're honoring for his knowledge. He had become integrated with the knowledge of Torah. He absorbed the knowledge. He identifies with it. So it's his. He acquired it. You could forgo something that you acquire. I can give away my property. I can give away my rights. But a king, the honor is not the king's. The honor is God. God who appointed the king. The king doesn't own the honor, and therefore he cannot forgo that honor. A little bit of a different explanation is given by Pinchas Halevi Hurwitz, the author of the book Hamakna and Hafloah, one of the great Hasidic masters who was an older colleague of the Alter Rebbe. And he says that Torah, when it talks about appointing a king, it uses a double expression, Som Tasim, you shall appoint upon yourself a king, which means that this mitzvah is a continuous mitzvah. Every second we have a commandment, appoint that person as your king. Well, if that's the basis of the fact that we have to honor him because the Torah says to appoint a king, then as soon as he forgoes his honor, you have a new obligation to appoint him as king, and therefore a new obligation to honor him. That is why he can't forgo it, because if he forgoes it, it only worked for that second. The next second, a new obligation commences. The commandments that are given to a king are in addition to the commandments that every person has. In fact, there are commandments that only a king has. A king is not allowed to have more money, kesef, silver and gold, than he needs for his running of his military and his palace. He cannot hoard gold and silver. He cannot have more horses, which in those days was the symbol of your power, and he cannot marry many wives, which in those days was not restricted to a commoner. The king had a restriction how many wives he can have. Now, the reason for these three restrictions is because money is something that could lead people astray. Horses, which is the symbol of power, could lead people astray. As the saying goes, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And wives, understandably, can lead the person astray. And the king had to have this extra obligation that he could not engage in those three things. And moreover, he had to have a special Torah scroll written in addition to a Torah scroll that he already owned, that he had to carry with him virtually wherever he would go, in whichever situation he was in, to be a constant reminder to him about the fact that he has a higher authority over him. There's a very cute story told by one of the legendary Hasidim, Reb Reuven Dunin, who was a teacher of Hasidus and a great Chassid in Israel, and he once quipped that our Rebbe is our king, he's our leader, and a leader is not allowed to have too many horses. Well, it doesn't only mean the physical horses, it means human horses. When we behave like horses, we are causing our leader to be in violation of that commandment, that he has too many horses. That means that whenever we denigrate ourselves to act in an animalistic way, we are actually harming our leader. While it was said in half in jest, it's a very serious concept that we affect our leaders. That's why it says when God told Moses that the Jewish people worship the golden calf, God tells Moses, raid, go down. And Rashi says, not just physically go down the mountain, but raid migedulascha, you will now have to go down. You were demoted. Your greatness has been challenged, has been undermined, because when the people misbehave, it brings the leader down as well. And of course, conversely, in the positive side, when we uplift ourselves, we uplift our leaders, and our leaders then could help uplift us even more. It's a cycle where we reinforce our leader, and our leader reinforces us. And that's especially true with regard to Mashiach. The Rebbe said, the more we show our willingness and our desire and our pleas for Mashiach and our closeness and our dedication to his leadership and his ideals, the more he is able to actualize his potential to be the Mashiach who will take us out of exile. The Torah then goes on to talk about the Kohanim, that their job is to serve God, and that's why we have to give them certain gifts. And then the Torah speaks about the prophet, that we're supposed to listen to what a prophet tells us. One of the 13 principles of faith is that God communicates to humanity through prophets, and whenever a prophet tells us what to do, we have to follow him. Now, how do we know a person is a prophet? Well, there's a background condition and a implementation condition. What I mean by that is that in order for someone to claim to be a prophet, he has to have a reputation as someone who is totally devoted to the teachings of the Torah, devotes his life strictly and exclusively to spiritual pursuits within the framework of the Torah, and who is scrupulously committed to its observance, and is constantly meditating and reflecting on God's greatness, and his mind is preoccupied with spiritual and heavenly matters. And then, when this person makes predictions that come true, several of them come true, he has the status of a prophet. It could also be a she, as there were feminine prophets. Huldah was one biblical one of the times of Jeremiah, and of course there were others. The matriarchs were prophets. But this person, once it is established that he or she is a prophet, and they tell us to do something, we are obligated to follow them, including if they tell us to violate a law of the Torah on a one-time basis, on an emergency, ad hoc basis. If they tell us that the laws of the Torah have changed, we know they're false prophets, because at Mount Sinai we were told that the Torah will never change. People who raise the argument that if God, when he gave the Torah 3,300 years ago, if they would have known, if it would have been known the way people live their lives today, the Torah would have agreed that we should change those laws. Well, that's a ridiculous argument, because God gave us the Torah and he knew the future. And if you say, well, God knew the future, but he was only talking to the people of that time, the Torah itself says clearly that no prophet can come to change the Torah. Even a prophet who speaks in the name of God can't change it. And then the Torah also makes it very clear, emphatically clear, that these laws are eternal laws for future generations. And incidentally, it's not so incidental, even though a prophet could tell us to do something that is a transgression on a one-time basis, there's an exception to that rule if he tells us to worship other gods. There is no way that any prophet could be a true prophet if he tells people, to, even if it's one time, for some very overriding reason, to save lives, to worship other gods. That cannot be countenanced, that prophet must be a false prophet. Then the Torah speaks about the cities of refuge. If a person kills someone unintentionally, but it's due to some degree of negligence, that person has to escape to a city of refuge where he would be rescued from the vengeant, pursuing relatives who would want to take revenge and kill him. He's safe in those cities of refuge. They're not allowed to touch him there. But it was also a atonement. It was a very severe form of punishment, as the Chinuch, the medieval commentator on the 613 Commandments, says that Golus, exile, is the second worst thing next to death. Now imagine how he would speak about prison as a punishment. It's absolutely the worst type of punishment. It's cruel and unusual, and it should only be used in the most of extreme situations. The Rebbe very strongly denounced the remedy of prison as being an ideal way of dealing with crime. Of course, there are cases, the Rebbe didn't advocate opening up the prisons, letting everyone out. The Rebbe advocated weaning ourselves off of that method of punishment, because prisons do not rehabilitate the prisoner, and they actually generate even more crime. The recidivism rate is extremely high. But nevertheless, the closest thing to prison would be the city of refuge, and he was sent there as partly as punishment, partly as be rescued from the relatives, but it's also an educational process, because these cities of refuge, unlike prisons, were bastions of spiritual knowledge, and the possibility of rehabilitation was real. There was a city that belonged to the Levites, who were the elite, who were the scholars, who were not involved in mundane activities, and that's where the person who was guilty of criminally negligent homicide would probably be the closest thing in contemporary terms to be rehabilitated. Now you might ask, but this was an accident. He didn't do it intentionally. And the answer is that when a person does something wrong due to negligence, that shows that there's a certain amount of insensitivity. When a person commits a crime willfully, of course it's terrible, especially if it's a violent crime, but one could attribute that to some type of really unusual, unexpected thing that happens. Someone gets you angry, someone cuts you off, to use a contemporary example, and you become angry. It sparks a certain anger. You had a bad day, and you can do something violent, which is inexcusable. But it doesn't mean that you are inherently an insensitive person. When people commit unintentional sins, especially if it's due to negligence, that shows a lack of sensitivity to others, that you can just blithely and nonchalantly go ahead and hurt someone or do something that would cause the death of an innocent person. For that, you need to have a rehabilitation of years of being in an environment that was conducive to spiritual growth and development. Now, we have cities of refuge in space. There are also cities of refuge in time, and that's the month we're in right now. The month of Elul is considered to be a month in which we could rehabilitate ourselves, resensitize ourselves, to take away the insensitivity that we have due to our strengthening of our animal soul. There's also a third type of city of refuge in the way we study Torah. Torah, the Talmud says, is a refuge. So we can absorb the Torah into our mind, and that resensitizes us, gives us new sensitivity. And that's why the Rebbe said that our way of preparing for the redemption should be through study of Torah, specifically the parts of Torah that deal with Mashiach and redemption, because we have a golus, an exile, tainted way of thinking. That's our mindset. To change our mindset, we need Torah. Torah gives us a new sensitivity, a new model, a paradigm shift, if you will. And that's why we have the important emphasis on Torah study. So we have three types of refuge. We have physical places that are refuge, and in contemporary terms, it means when you go to a synagogue to pray, when you go to a house of study to learn Torah, when you're in an environment of holy people and good people, that's a city of refuge. Then you have times of refuge, the month of Elul, and then you have the experience of refuge, which is the study of Torah. The Torah then goes on to talk about fighting battles, and it then talks about not chopping down fruit-bearing trees, and it says, Ki ha'adam eitz hasada. One translation of that is that a person is likened to the tree of the field. A person is likened to a tree. What is the most important part of the tree? Most people would argue it's the fruits and the roots, which happens to rhyme. The fruits and the roots. Although you need every part. You need the trunk, you need the branches, you need the twigs, but it's the fruits and the roots that are the most essential parts of the tree. The roots is what gives the tree its life. The fruits carry the seeds in them for further growth. That shows that it's really alive. Now, the roots are covered up. You don't see the roots, so you don't really pay much attention to them, not until they break through your sidewalk. You realize that the roots are huge and very powerful. But the roots represent, in terms of our service of God, the faith that we have in God. Although faith itself isn't all that there is to Judaism. In fact, Judaism is about 613 commandments, but nevertheless, the roots of all of our observances are the faith that we have, and it dispels the myth that Judaism doesn't focus on faith as other religions do. It does focus on faith. It just considers it to be not the ultimate, all that there is to do is to have faith. It's the ultimate foundation and root of the tree, which is the human being. The rest of the human being, the trunks, the branches, those are the things that make up the human gestalt, that makes up our personality, our mind, our understanding, our emotions. And the fruits represent the results of all of who we are in terms of the good deeds that we do. But the fruit has to have seeds, and these seeds are responsible for growth. We can't just keep our knowledge and our devotion to God to ourselves. We have to replenish the tree and the fruits and bring it to another generation. And in order to do that, you have to have seeds. Now, seeds, like the roots, have no taste. They're covered up, they're concealed, because what you give over to others, what really makes the difference is not the sophistication of your presentation. It's the sincerity, it's the simplicity, it's the fundamental aspect. When the student sees the depth of your convictions, of your faith, of your devotion, that has the power to reproduce and bring more people into the fold. The Talmud asks a question on this verse. It says, Ki ha'adam eitz hasada, is a person a tree of the field? And the Talmud says, no. It means that if a person behaves properly, a Torah scholar behaves properly, then the fruits are good fruits. Otherwise, the fruits are no good. But it doesn't answer the question. What does the Torah mean when it says a person is like a tree? And the Rebbe once explained that the word for person here is Adam. Adam is the most distinguished label that you can give a human being. There are other ways of saying a person, Ish, Gever, Enosh, but Adam means the ultimate sophisticated human being. Now, you would think, what makes the human being superior to everything else? It's our superior intellect. The tree is a metaphor for emotions. So the question is, why would we identify the height of humanity with our emotions? That's more like an animal. An animal is governed by its emotions primarily. A human being is an intellect. So why would we compare the Adam, the intellectual stature of a person, to the tree, which is a symbol of one's emotions? And the answer is that yes, the ultimate greatness of the human being, you could say, is the fact that he has sophisticated knowledge. But that knowledge is worthless if it doesn't translate into emotional attributes as well. If our understanding of God's greatness doesn't lead to loving Him and having reverence for Him, if our understanding of the importance of a mitzvah doesn't lead to us doing it with love, then it means that our understanding is flawed, and that doesn't come as a compliment to our humanity. We're not proud of our humanity just because we have brilliant scientists. If that brilliant scientist, or for that matter, Havdil, even a brilliant Torah scholar, doesn't translate that knowledge in practice via the emotions, then that intellectual greatness is not becoming of a human being. So the ultimate goal of Adam, of the sophisticated intellectual human being, is Eitz HaSadeh, when he becomes like a tree, the symbol of one's emotions, which ultimately will bring good fruits, refreshing fruits that will produce more fruits and more fruits, and will have enduring value. Have a good night and a good Shabbos, a good week.